We have one of the industry's big luminaries on where nickel is at. Perhaps you've been reading some of his contributions to the Northern Miner. It's going to be Anthony Milewski, but I'm going to first introduce Adrian Pocabelli, who many of you will know as the Northern Miners podcast host, does an amazing job every week distilling the news and bringing you all great guests. Adrian joining us from Berlin. How are you doing today, Adrian?
Hey, thanks, Anthony. Let me know if I'm too loud or too quiet or whatever. Doing well. Beautiful weather in Berlin, so that's exciting. Like Mark Jarvis, he's got me all fired up, frankly, listening to that discussion and what he was just saying on China and how the West is falling behind. So yeah, I can't wait to get into this.
Fantastic. Yeah, he set it up beautifully. And I see Anthony Milowski's joined us as well, the chairman of Nickel 28. How are you doing over there, Anthony? Great to see you.
Great. Thanks for having me, Adrian, Anthony. Always a pleasure to speak with you guys.
Fantastic. Well, it's an honor to have you here. Adrian's joining us from Berlin. Adrian, I was excited that from Vancouver to Newfoundland it was sunny, but now we can extend it all the way over to Western Europe. The whole world is sunny right now, apparently. That's great. Listen, I'll turn it over to you guys. Adrian, you can introduce Anthony, and we're looking forward to a really good conversation here.
Okay, thanks, Anthony. That was, again, great show so far. And I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to talk to Anthony, who is Anthony Milowski, who has written several articles for the Northern Miner, many of which I've read on the podcast. And he is chairman of Nickel 28, and a longstanding investor in the mining sector. And so he is very qualified to discuss this topic. And he's written about several different commodities. And, a lot of some of the favorites of many of the investors that read our newspaper, such as uranium, cobalt, and now nickel, and some of the more you might think of as boring metals traditionally, but now they're pretty exciting. So Anthony, first of all, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So I'm going to jump right into it here, and then we can kind of go wherever we go. But I was listening to Mark Jarvis's presentation there, and something really struck me about how he was comparing the West and China, and how in China, they don't really worry so much about the IRR so much. And I guess my kind of big question for you is, in the West, are we too focused on the investment side of things, and we're not thinking, as Mark Jarvis put it, strategically enough? Are we falling behind by just, in a sense, over obsessing on money? There's my strange first question for you.
I mean, it's kind of a complex question. So, I mean, I think you got to talk about like communist capitalism. So, when China makes an investment, it's making an investment on behalf of its citizens with taxpayer dollars effectively. And when we're talking about, say, Canada and the US, corporations are investing the money on behalf of their shareholders who are seeking the highest IRR return for the capital in these public companies or private equity funds. And so I think when you're asking a question, what you're really asking is, should the Canadian government, should the American government, should the Australian government be investing in these projects to secure the supply chain? Because as Mark indicated, China is years ahead of the West in doing this. And the answer is, if the free market isn't going to fund these, then the only way these projects are getting funded is, one, with a higher commodity price, or two, with subsidies from governments.
So where does that leave us? Because in a sense, we have discussion, conference after conference, where the Chinese are way ahead of us, and in a sense, it never seems to lead anything. So from your perspective, I mean, you're the head of a Nickel 28, a mining company. You're very well learned on the subject and engaged. It's your daily job. What needs to happen in your view can you connect the dots for us?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a great question, and it's an important one. I think the basic answer is it has to become important to the governments, and it simply isn't. I mean, you can imagine everything that they're dealing with, COVID and the printing of money and all these other issues. I just don't think it's really on anyone's agenda. And so I don't really foresee how the gap gets closed. And what China is doing is they're really taking and bringing Detroit, as it were, to China. They don't want to sell you a battery. They don't want to sell you MHP. They want to sell you a car. And this is a strategy on behalf of the Chinese government to bring this industry to China. And at this moment in time, it's pretty hard to see how they don't have a stronghold on the supply chain for years to come. There are a couple projects in Canada like Dumont and Turnagain there that potentially you need over $1 billion each to come into production in years of time. And the Chinese are around the world buying the assets today. So I just don't know if we can close the gap. It's going to be more a situation of whether or not we can at least kind of get on the board, as it were, with some new production.
Interesting. So from your perspective then, so how is Canada doing from your perspective? As far as developing its commodities, are you happy
Canada
with
has
it?
great assets.
Should the government be doing
Yeah,
more?
Canada has a great legal framework. One of the great things about Canada is there is a great framework for buying and selling properties, for investing in properties, for streams and royalties, a framework that almost doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. Sure, Australia also has a great framework, but I think you have the rule of law of Canada, and you have a great backdrop, and you have great deposits. But my experience is that based on the current political climate, it's just not going to be the case that Chinese companies are going to invest in Canada anytime soon in the resource space. It could be years. And instead, they've gone to Africa, they've gone to PNG, Indonesia in particular, and they're heading down a little bit of a different path. And so, Canada, on the one hand, has done a great job in creating an environment where all sorts of companies and commodities have a chance. But the key difference here is the cost of capital. And the cost of capital associated with China for projects that are invested in by the Chinese government effectively, or the SOEs, is simply lower. And so it's a basic decision that has to be made at the government level in Canada or the US or wherever in the West. Do we want to extend our taxpayer money to build these mines? And I think to date the answer is no. And frankly, I don't see it happening anytime soon. There's so many other problems inside of our societies that people don't realize how critical this is to an electric future. And it's probably pretty untenable to start building multi-billion-dollar mines in Sudbury, I would think. So, I would imagine that nothing is going to change anytime soon inside of Canada and the US, notwithstanding whatever the rhetoric is.
It does seem that way, doesn't it? I hosted a panel on low-grade nickel deposits in Sudbury, and believe it or not, it was a fascinating chat. I was quite proud that we all seemed to make it pretty interesting. And that is my impression, is that these things won't be developed, or that there's it came to me that it's, my conclusion was that maybe sometime if the investors show up and the price of nickel goes high enough and we can convince the investors, and what year is that going to be? Right. So it just gets this, there's no priority. And back to maybe I'm sounding too political, so I'll back up a bit, but it just seems to me like if there's economic problems in Canada, why aren't we building the multi-billion-dollar nickel mine in Dumont in Ontario? I don't understand. Shouldn't that help our money printing problem?
Yeah, look, it's a political question, right? It's a question.
Is it? Okay. So,
but, if I was the government, I think the government's question is, should we be building a mine, or should we be building, installed capacity for vaccines? Those are probably the questions that they're grappling with. And I think it's a moot point. China has already won. China embarked maybe even 7 to 10 years ago on the path of electrifying their grid. And, what I think is really interesting that no one talks about is, China is a global leader in environmental policy right now. Let that sink in for a second. Not America, not Europe, not Canada, it's China. And I say that because the Chinese government has a constituency, that's the people that live there. And maybe it's not a democracy like we think about it, but ultimately they are beholden to that constituency. And they've said that there is enough pollution in the air, enough pollution in the food. And the only way to clean this up is to change the way that automobiles and similar vehicles are powered. And so they've gone ahead and they've started to do that, and they're years ahead of us. I'm always blown away by how much further ahead. And, as part of that strategy, they went out and they bought the cobalt in the Congo They've bought copper deposits around the world. They've bought lithium deposits around the world. And we're not going to catch up in nickel. We might catch up in lithium just because of the position and the geopolitics of lithium. But in nickel in particular, the problem is that if you look at the last cycle and you look at HPAL, one of the great destroyers of value, maybe the single largest destroyer of value in the mining sector was HPAL. Whether it was Goro, between $2 to $6 billion over budget, and Badavi, multiple billions over budget. Investors really lost money. So in addition to whatever the cost of capital is today, in the market amongst fund managers, you just have a memory of, when we think tens of billions of dollars of destruction of capital with HPAL. So I don't see that it's going to happen, frankly. And so if you're a Ford or a Tesla, you probably have to plan accordingly and go out yourself and maybe try and do offtake agreements and make other investments to secure your nickel. Or when it comes, it's going to be problematic. The nickel market today is like 2.7 million tons, give or take, with 65% of that being steel, right? The driver of nickel today is steel. And the battery market is about 200 to 300,000 tons of that overall amount, so roughly 10%. But there's 40 kilograms of nickel roughly in today's battery in each car. So when you get to 400,000 tons of demand from batteries a year, the market is going to be really tight. I mean, amazingly tight, and that's going to push nickel higher. And maybe that's a moment where some of these Canadian projects are able to raise money, real money.
So we're back to square one in a sense for me, from my perspective, because I was asking these CEOs, what do you need from the government? And what was super interesting about it was that they didn't seem like they wanted government money, almost as if that would be a problem and might complicate things, and they might be right. So it's just interesting because, it gets you, just makes you wonder how we're ever going to develop these projects.
So in Canada today, there are basically two projects. Well, there's of course Voisey's Bay with its greenfield expansion or brownfield expansion, but that's something different. Like there's Dumont, which is owned by Waterton, and they're running a sales process. At least that's what the market thinks, or we've heard in the market. And then there's Turnagain. I mean, those are the two projects, and Dumont is quite a bit ahead of Turnagain. It's permitted. They're both sulfides, and so they don't have some of those HPAL issues, but that's it. Everything else is still years behind and, not clear that they'll hit this cycle. And so you've got to start looking at Australia, some of the low grade stuff in Australia that's more advanced, or you got to look at places like Indonesia, which is what the Chinese have done. They've gone to Indonesia and are building huge capacity in Indonesia.
Okay, so now regarding what you're saying, which was, I think, would surprise a lot of people, as you're sort of alluding to about China's environmental, in a sense, record, you would claim that it's actually superior to the West. Do I have that right? And what is that? Because I mean, well, I think the popular understanding is that they're not, but tell me more.
Well, I would just say that on this point, they are taking the global lead. They are literally out there developing the resource capacity, but not just that, really, even the installed industrial capacity to build batteries and cars in a way that no one else is doing. It's being subsidized by the government. And we're just sitting here talking about basically NMC and NCA batteries, nickel, manganese, cobalt, nickel, cobalt, aluminum batteries. But by the way, LFP, another technology, is being further refined in China. Hydrogen. So all these technologies have the aim of keeping the Chinese population happy by reducing pollution. And while Biden is talking about infrastructure and the Green New Deal, it's years and years behind what has been transpiring in China. And so they, in my view, have taken a global role as a leader in policy by putting money behind this notion that they need to have an electrified vehicle fleet. But
okay, excellent.
It is complicated. And I'll give you an example. So
please do.
Yeah. So what happened with the last nickel cycle was nickel ran really hard, And it was primarily a market controlled by HPAL and ferro production, right? And then the Chinese started buying these old, processes. And what they did was these old furnaces, and what they did was they were able to create nickel pig iron, and that added, today was become over 700,000 metric tons of nickel pig iron, nickel supply into the supply chain, effectively crashing the price of nickel for a decade. And what we started to see was nickel run. We saw a bunch of financings kind of like, within the last year. And then Tianjin, who was responsible in the last cycle for this nickel pig iron revolution, came out and said, well, by the way, we're going to convert nickel pig iron to nickel matte. And that just took the edge off nickel, but it was a bit of a false narrative, because one, Valley's been doing this for a long time. That's not new technology. But in order for it to work, you have to have a nickel price, because it's basically energy. So you've got nickel pig iron, and now you have to add energy and sulfur to create nickel matte. And now that you've got nickel matte, you have to dissolve that again to make a chemical and put it into batteries. And that's highly energy intensive. And so while that technology exists and has existed, let's be clear, for a long time, the price of nickel doesn't warrant actually that conversion. And that's really what's held up the market over the last 6 to 12 months, is this idea that Tianjin has come up with a more inexpensive way of doing that. The other problem with this is, carbon footprints have become in vogue as ESG investing and just sort of general awareness of our environment increases. What you have with this process that the Chinese are touting that they've refined enough to make competitive is a much more carbon intensive process. So an HPAL nickel unit has around 16 tons per unit of 16 tons of carbon per unit of nickel. When you go into that nickel pig iron arena, that goes up to like 45 to 85. And then you add in the additional energy to convert it to nickel matte. And you're talking about a massive, like maybe 10-fold increase in carbon footprint. And so one of the interesting or complex things is, let's pretend China wins. They've built all the infrastructure. Is the world prepared to buy these electric vehicles on pretty dirty carbon footprint nickel production? And so that is a nuance which the market hasn't really even contemplated yet, is this Indonesian conversion from nickel pig iron to nickel matte is extremely carbon intensive and in a way kind of counterintuitive to the idea that you're going to go sell electric vehicles and not have a carbon footprint.
I see. So from your perspective then, is China winning the war or the contest to create electric vehicle batteries and electric vehicles, in your view? Is it just based, I guess, from the perspective of the batteries?
Well, if this was like a baseball World Series, and we had seven games to win the World Series, they've already won the first 3 games, and we better be careful that they don't win the 4th. So there's no contest. I don't know any serious person that will tell you that the West is anywhere close in terms of winning anything. Now, that doesn't mean it can't change or it won't change. Tesla has done a fantastic job of building a car that people like. You saw the rollout of the F-150, the electric F-150, the most popular selling truck in America. It's going to be huge. But fundamentally, we are a long ways behind. And I think what automobile makers, and I've spoken with them on and off now for years, fail to understand is that some of these materials are not like buying aluminum, where you just have your procurement guy call up and say, hey, I'll take X and Y, send it over. And instead, the time from discovery to production is a decade or more in some cases for a nickel, copper, cobalt, lithium deposit. They didn't understand that. And so if you look at the capacity for the vehicles that's being built out in the West, it's insanely big, right? I mean, almost every week, another Lamborghini I saw within the last week said all their cars are going to be electric by 2030, right? So everyone has built the car, but no one's got the battery, and that is clearly 100% securely in the domain of China today. So much so that you had, Tesla do a big roundabout if you look at the early kind of musings of Elon, he only talks about his NCA battery and how great it is. Well, he stepped back from that, and they're talking about an LFP battery because it's much cheaper. The materials are less scarce, and you really don't need a big battery if you're just driving around the Bay Area, right? Like, how far are you really going in a day? And so you can already see him walking that back. And where the rubber is going to meet the road here is when we do ramp up in the kind of 18 to 36 month window, like where these batteries going to come from if the Chinese control the material. And I can just give you some insight. As chairman of Nickel 28, we're the largest producer of MHP in the world. MHP is probably the best material to go directly into a battery, just because it's already, because of the dissolving it with acid is very easy. And the payabilities we're getting are, amazing, right? Like, I've probably never seen anything quite like it. And that's all going into China. That's going into electric vehicles, and so that pressure is only going to mount, and it's only going to get harder. And it is what it is.
Okay, so switching gears slightly, I think we've sort of illustrated that aspect, which is quite interesting to hear from your perspective as someone, again, who's the head of a nickel company. So tell me about supply, and how's the supply of nickel? And we can talk about other commodities as well, but since we're on the topic and of lithium and nickel and cobalt, I guess those are probably some of the main metals that we'd put in these batteries since we're on the topic. How are our supplies? Do you have any sort of insight into where things are or views?
Yeah, I mean, if you start with cobalt, I guess, cobalt, there's, I would say, plenty of cobalt, except for it all sits in the DRC. Right. I mean, cobalt is a byproduct of HPAL, nickel production globally. But that's kind of a meaningless amount relative to the DRC. And so, Glencore or whoever wants to operate there, China is able to operate in the Congo. It just becomes a question of, do you want your entire supply chain to be dependent on what's happening in the Congo? Right. I mean, that's a pretty tough call as a business. That's the reality. But I would say if it could be managed, which I'm not even suggesting it could be managed, but if it could be managed, you would say that there is cobalt in the Congo, if people could mine there and kind of overcome some of the child labor issues and those issues. But it's scary if you're Ford or Tesla and your image is being built on clean energy, and then a picture in the Wall Street Journal of a 12-year-old kid pops up. Like, that's it's sad in the first instance, but in the second instance, it's damaging to your brand. So I think that's the state of play for cobalt. The plays in North America are by and large so small that while they may be profitable and a good investment, they really don't do anything to the global supply. And so it really is going to be beyond either Russia or the DRC. Russia has potential on some of their deposits. You move to lithium.
Could I stop you just on the cobalt while we're there? How
Sure.
critical is cobalt? Because it seems like the talk on cobalt is, sometimes it sounds like it's more critical than other times as far as making batteries. It almost comes in and out of fashion. Do I have that right? Or
yeah, well, what I would say is people have to understand that these battery chemistries and battery technologies are in transition, and they are constantly evolving and changing in the ratio, and and even, as I said earlier, transitioning from a nickel manganese cobalt to an LFP battery. That's always in transition. But once again, long story short, when that supply ramps up, cobalt will be short. It'll be in short supply. And where people will go to produce more is they'll go to the Congo, because that's where you're going to have to go. I mean, you can get a little bit out of here and there in Canada, but it's irrelevant numbers relative to what's going to be needed. And so that's going to come out of the Congo. I would tell you, interestingly, that a lot of the nickel deposits that need to be made, like a Dumont or a Turnagain, the ratio of nickel to cobalt is roughly 10-1, which is probably where the battery chemistries are going. So if some of these nickel mines were built and they kept the cobalt unit, that would be helpful. Just a little asterisk is important. The process of taking nickel pig iron to nickel matte destroys the cobalt unit. So that's kind of an aside, but important to note there. So
sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you again, but so are you saying, in other words, that these projects like Dumont kind of have a perfect recipe if the policymakers wanted to actually develop this? Is that? what you were saying?
Perfect recipe. I would
Well,
say
a good recipe.
yeah, today is in terms of what the battery looks like today, roughly speaking, the ratio of nickel to cobalt is similar to the battery. So, I mean, in a way, if you think about offsetting it, it kind of offsets. But to sum up cobalt, we're going to have to go to the Congo. It's the only place to go to get the volume that's needed. And so that is a problem someone's going to have to work out in the coming years.
Okay, great. And yeah, moving on to lithium.
Well, lithium is different. I mean, like I think that lithium has some real ESG problems coming up. I mean, can you imagine going to a dry desert, evaporating, a reservoir that can't be recharged, putting all this caustic salt, just destroying any life? I mean, this is pretty nasty stuff. Once again, for an element that's meant to be powering, clean energy. So I think the big breakthrough for lithium and frankly, the risk for the equities is someone is going to crack direct extraction, and it will literally have the impact that nickel pig iron had on nickel a decade ago. The day, and there are a bunch of people trying and billions of dollars have been spent, but someone will crack that. And the day that is cracked, that market completely changes. The problem is, if you think about it, when you are evaporating water, your energy is free. It's energy from the sun, it's solar. When you're doing direct extraction, you basically have to take that same amount of energy and pay for it in order to expedite that evaporation process. So no one has done that yet. They've done it in small scale, but I think there's plenty of lithium on this earth. It's one of the most common elements. It's just getting that process down. And I have conviction that will happen. It might take time and lithium might go higher first, but someone will figure that out.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. My girlfriend's from Bolivia, and yeah, when you talk about lithium, it's just these nightmarish companies that come in and destroy the beautiful, Salazars or whatever they call them. Yeah, so I mean, at least that's the public perception. So, which is interesting that you say that.
Oh, but that's not public. I mean, like you got all these salts that are there, and the wind blows them away, and it's not great. It just isn't. And so the public is right. Now it's going to continue on, but someone will figure out direct extraction eventually. I'm confident.
Okay, excellent. And so, and as far as nickel, how is the supply situation? We heard Mark Jarvis say 2027, 2028. Do you have a similar, where we're going to start running into real constraints? Do you have a similar view or otherwise?
Well, I think the wild card is obviously stainless steel. And so if governments globally decide that we got to spend our way out of whatever it is that we're in right now, and you have the Biden infrastructure plan, you have some infrastructure plan in the EU, and that drives stainless demand up, then I think that this gets pulled forward, even into the next 18 to 36 months. And I don't think, the one good thing, of course, about nickel is that there are a lot of known deposits globally. Like there's no shortage of nickel deposits. It's just about the clearing price to produce it. And so, you'll probably see a ramp up of production in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, because that's easy. The regulations are probably different than in Canada, and the bulk of that nickel will probably go into the Chinese machine. So that's the most likely outcomes. I don't think you're going to actually see shortages. I just think you'll see a higher price to support whatever the new nickel demand is. And by the way, it could be just like copper, if that infrastructure really happens, and then you've got a bunch of people buying F-150s, because remember, a battery is sized for the weight of the car or truck. So if you start having, big trucks electrified, well, that battery could be a multiple the size of whatever is in your basic sedan.
Interesting. And just a final point on this, would you consider nickel to be a green metal? We hear copper being a kind of a green metal. It sounds like if it's used in batteries that we'd consider nickel a green metal too, but I don't hear it that often. What do you think?
Well, it's absolutely critical to the batteries. I mean, you can't remove it yet, at least not for the long range batteries. So I think there's no question that it's critical to electric vehicles as we currently envision them. So yeah, I would say it is, just because even though today 65% goes into stainless, you're talking about needing as much as 50% of the global nickel market in expansion to meet a fully electrified world, and maybe more. So even, it's interesting, even as the amount of nickel and cobalt decline, in the batteries as the chemistry shift. If you really have a fully adopted electric world, you're going to need a lot more of this stuff. And that's why, by the way, like these conversations have started about mining the ocean floor, nodule mining.
Right.
Frank Juster has that RTO he's doing right now, and there's probably 3 or 4 of these companies out there in different kind of states of play, and that can only be a conversation to be had in a market that's higher prices.
Yeah, that's a very interesting area. The Deep Green is one of the big explorers out there. And yeah, we actually interviewed him on the podcast, the CEO, whose name escapes me at the moment. But it sounds like it's pretty environmentally friendly, according to him. But yeah, then you run into the green people and they're not too excited about it. So question that's maybe a little naive, but maybe you have insight on this. What's your view? Do you know anything about the supply lines of, say, something like nickel and maybe lithium or cobalt? Is it something to be concerned about? Are they just normal infrastructure? I know nothing about the supply lines. Do you know anything about this?
I would say, well, first of all, a lot of these mines are in Cuba, in the Congo, and a bunch of places like that. And what I would say is you have geopolitical risk, especially if these countries are unvaccinated and they're having all sorts of problems. But the larger kind of risk is supply chain associated with moving bulk commodities or just commodities in general. So if shipping is reaching decade highs, well, that knocks through to the underlying commodity. And then, there's other things like if you're going to make MHP or you're going to do nickel matte from nickel pig iron, you're going to need sulfur. Well, sulfur is going up. So I think mining suffers from the same supply chain issues as every other industry. You're going to be able to get tires. Did your tires come from China? Is that factory operating? Is there a new tariff? So those sort of supply chain issues are almost identical to any business that kind of relies on this global integrated supply chain that we've kind of been so fortunate to have in the recent decades. Okay,
excellent. And so I have one quick question before we go to some Q&A from the audience. And it looks like we got 3 here, which are really interesting. But just putting on your economist hat briefly, the question of the moment on inflation, do you think this is transitory, or do you think this is kind of here to stay as someone who's, say, running a commodity company like yourself? Well, what's your view on that?
Okay, let me answer that question with a question. If I told you next year there was going to be 20% more copper, 20% more coal, 20% more fill in the blank, would you tell me that the price would be higher or lower? If the supply of any given commodity was just magically 20% bigger next year, what would you tell me? Would that be worth more or less, that commodity? Be worth less, right?
One would think.
Right, because if you pump up a bunch of copper, someone's got to buy it. There's not 20% more demand next year. So in the last kind of 12 to 14 months, 23% of all dollars printed in the history of the dollar have been printed. So we've taken the US money supply and we've increased it by over 20%. Thus, I think devaluing and debasing the dollar. Look at the Canadian US exchange at the moment, or even the US Great British Pound exchange. So you see declining dollar. I think it's highly inflationary. I don't know, how hard commodities are going to go, but I think certainly that certain parts of this have a demand story and then a story connected to the printing. And I don't see that subsiding kind of immediately. Now, other things like lumber is totally different. Lumber was a supply issue because the mills closed. I think that's already correcting. The futures have been a limit down 3 trading periods in a row. OSB in the US, that's a glue issue out of China. So certain things, I think, returned a more normal situation. But in particular, for these commodities, with all the pressure and printing going on, and there's another 4 trillion slated in the US, it's hard to see that you're not going to subside.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you for answering that. Okay, so we have a few questions here. We're back to the John Clark. How can we compete with China? Yeah, sort of my original, I keep asking this question in a sense over and over. And let me I'll just finish the question for Mr. Clark here. China gives credence to environmental and social thing, or gives, as he puts it, lip service. Western governments have ESG. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Go ahead. So how do we compete with China? It's back to my original question, which
Yeah, but
I
you
can't get
We're not,
an answer
we're
on.
not competing. Yeah, like this. It's like we shouldn't even talk. Not us, but I mean, like this shouldn't be a panel every conference now. It's over. Like we can't compete. It's very binary. Either the Canadian, American, Western governments decide they're going to make these investments, equity investments, or we wait for the price to go higher. Because if you're a private equity firm, you've got all your investors, you've promised them that you're going to make money. They're not going to invest in a mine that has a negative IRR. They're going to do that. So we can't compete. Their cost of capital is zero because it's a government and they're using the taxpayer money. And unless the price of nickel goes higher and it becomes an attractive investment, remember we're competing with tech and crypto and everything else. Unless it becomes attractive, the free market won't fund it. And if the government doesn't fund it, then we're not competing and there's nothing, that's it.
Well, but isn't the answer, shouldn't we subsidize the heck out of it? And I'm an artist half the time and I've never applied for a grant in my life. So I'm not some Mr. Go get a grant from the government guy. I've made a point of not being that. But when I see this, could we compete then? Or
Look, if the Canadian government said we're going to give Dumont $1.5 billion zero interest loan, to build it, like, yeah, of course. If Dumont starts getting built tomorrow in that case. But I think you guys are worried about vaccinating this, rolling out your vaccination efforts, and which you're trailing the US in that. So, and I would make the same comment about Australia and America. So the answer is yes, of course. You give Dumont 1.5 billion, you give Mark Jarvis whatever he needs. Yeah, that mine can be built and it can produce, and away we go. But that's not real. I don't see that happening.
Right, and maybe not sustainable, or you just don't see it from a policy perspective.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, we have another one from Leah Cole. Is there a real problem with public trust in mining? If so, are these provinces and territories that are improving public trust or confidence better than the others? So do we have a problem with the public still with mining, and which provinces are doing the best, or territories?
Yeah, I think there will always be a problem. When you build a tailings dam, eventually that dam fails. Every dam eventually fails. And if you're trying to build, a mine in an environmentally sensitive place, people should be suspicious. Like I was against building a gold mine in Bristol Bay. I like to go salmon fishing every year, and you've seen what's happened with these tailing accidents. And so I think it's great for people to be ask questions and really focus. And some mines shouldn't be built. There's no question that there are areas that are too sensitive, and those mines shouldn't be built. Now, if you say no mines in Canada should be built, then you have to accept that they're going to be built in Congo. It's a different point. But I do think that citizens and journalists and executives and fund managers should really push and look at these projects, because accidents happen and no project is perfect. So yeah, I think people should scrutinize the sector and the space, because when that tailings dam breaks and all this toxic sludge gets pushed through some pristine river system, like that's bad, and that shouldn't happen. So people should make sure that the environmental standards are there and that they continue to watch.
Okay, excellent. And continuing on, we have another question, sort of recycling based. When do you think mining companies, this is from John Clark as well, when do you think mining companies will mine metals and other materials from municipal garbage dumps? Do you have any thoughts, I guess, on recycling in general, or is that possible? I suppose why not, but I don't know. What do you think?
Well, one of the big SPAC deals of the last 6 months was a company called Li-Cycle, which I can't remember the exact valuation, but in my mind, it's somewhere around $800 million, a Canadian company, a great bunch of guys who raised a few $100 million through a SPAC to actually tackle this exact problem. The Chinese have been working on this once again for 5 or 6 years. I think that there are a tremendous number of companies working on this problem. And in fact, batteries will become like a circular economy, in the sense that especially, remember, we keep talking about electric vehicles, but there's stationary batteries for your house and solar, and all that's going to be connected. And so there's no question that recycling is continuing to evolve. It's been pretty toxic up to this point, in terms of like the processes to actually extract the metals. But, people have spent a lot of time and money and are continuing to spend to solve that problem. So Li-Cycle is one that comes to mind in Canada, where those guys have really done a great job. But there are a bunch of Chinese companies working on that as well. And that will help alleviate a generation out. That'll help alleviate some of the problems. And a generation, because remember, when you buy a car, it's going to last for 10 or 15, 20 years.
Okay, very good. And another part where the Chinese, for whatever reason, are just going to totally outcompete us. And we have a final question here before we log off. Do we have time for the final question, Anthony?
Yeah, we do. I'm just coming on to tell you just one more, and that'll be it.
Okay, perfect. So as far as the subsidies, we have one from Harry Sanders. Couldn't this be resolved via import taxes on Chinese batteries? So we're getting deep in the weeds on the politics here. But what do you think of subsidies or CO2 taxation, as you just wrote? What do you think about import?
Canada literally does not have the expertise to build batteries inside of Canada. Could it buy it? Could it develop it? Maybe. I don't think that's viable. I just don't think that would work. I mean, like hypothetically, it could work, but I don't foresee that. I just look. America, Detroit, dominated the world with producing and selling cars for generations, and there's every chance that there'll be outbound Chinese M&A a decade on, buying up brands, and you're going to buy a Ford truck, and Ford's going to be owned by a Chinese. I mean, that's potentially where we're heading, and time moves on, and the foreseeable future would tell us that the Chinese are going to dominate and control this industry. They already are, and they're kind of putting their entire country and financial system behind it.
Fascinating. Okay, Anthony, thank you for joining us. Everybody, Anthony Milowski, Nickel 28.
Great conversation, gentlemen. Thank you for that, Anthony. Thank you for your time. Adrian, great job leading the charge. And thank you to our audience for such great questions.